Well, guys, it's time to talk about every single book that I read in the year of 2022. Why am I doing this and not making another cartoon video? Well, I kind of wanted to explain where I've been all this year. I've been kind of off and on making videos. I've done a few of these like in front of the camera videos. I did one earlier last year talking about Metroid Prime 4. Honestly, you know, I was kind of jumping the gun on that one because we definitely didn't get any Prime 4 last year. So, you know, but I really do want to try to explain why I was so infrequent. Really, the last big thing that I did was the OKKO video, and that was a huge undertaking. I'm not kidding when I say that the video took multiple years to kind of conceptualize and finish. It was just always in the background, and I wanted to do it ever since the show ended, basically, do a true follow-up to my very first video where I talked about the show itself and what it means to me. So I'm glad everybody liked it and enjoyed it. But actually, talking about books is exactly why I didn't make too many videos this year, because I was working on writing a book of my own. So I wanted to get a bunch of examples. I have right here my Goodreads. I've logged every single book that I've read, including the ones that I've read already starting this year. And I wanted to do something a little bit special with it. Yes, I am going to keep making cartoon videos, don't you worry. I won't get into it because it's personal, but I do have a free day open on the weekends now. I used to work 6 days a week, now I only work 5, so a little extra time to make all those Adventure Time videos. But I'm also really excited to kind of catalog this weird experiment I went on, because I really haven't read any books since high school. Maybe like 4 or 5 books since high school. I was never really a huge book reader to begin with. I was always more focused on TV shows and video games. Even like movies, I'm not very like well versed on, even though I had for a while of a movie podcast. But I just want to do kind of a long but like low effort video to kind of like tide everybody over until I get that second Adventure Time thing done. So here we are. I'm going to go through all this. Maybe somebody in my fucking audience is like interested in these book reviews. Maybe I'll do more of them in the future. I was kind of inspired by Man Holding Thing or Man Carrying Thing to do a video like this, because I like his a book review roundups so much. He's kind of like the only booktuber that I consistently watch. But normally he does like 5 books. I'm doing 40 books in this one video. So just buckle in. It's going to be a long time. So number 1, we have Watership Down by Richard Adams. I give it 4 stars, and my review is Enter the Waking Nightmare World of Being a Rabbit. Watership Down I knew from the animated film. I'd never actually seen the movie. I did know its reputation as being like a fucked up thing that kids shouldn't watch. I thought that the book was really good, really interesting, you know, exploring the mind of a rabbit, exploring the world through like, okay, what are these creatures that we kind of see as, you know, these like beacons of fertility? You know, they're always fucking, they're always reproducing. Why do they do that? Oh, because they're always being hunted. What kind of mentality would a creature that's always being hunted have? Maybe the best compliment I can give it is that while I think that the goriness isn't necessarily present, at least in the book, I mean, there are some like violent fights and everything, I think where it picks up the slack as far as like actually being mature is in its themes, and talking about death and talking about like these kind of like existential themes that you can cover obviously when following human characters, but feel more salient when through the eyes of these animals specifically. I know that I watched a video by some guy, Cardinal West I think his name is, and he's all about like xenofiction and shit like that. I think this is the only one that I read, so I have no other input on it other than I really like this one. I always wanted to read it, and it definitely delivered. I think like the premise and the writing style more so delivered than like the characters and the plot and everything, but those were excellent as well, or at least those were serviceable as well. It was just like a good full. Next up, for you fantasy nerds, and I did read, it's mostly fantasy, by the way. You know, I know what I'm about. I know what I've been writing. It's mostly a fantasy type story. So I wanted to read a bunch of fantasy to see like where I shook out opinion wise, and like where my book was kind of like, where is it in the spectrum of fantasy? So we went with Wheel of Time for my like first big series to go to. I saw that from some people that I followed online that it had themes related to like Hinduism and Buddhism. Those are very interesting to me, so I wanted to go with that. It's not quite as hard on that stuff as I wanted, but either way, I loved the first book. I gave it 4 stars. I won't read the review because it's a lot longer than the funny one-sentence review that I gave for Watership Down. But I think that it was like an excellent quest fantasy, and that's kind of like maybe my favorite type of fantasy, honestly. You know, I grew up with Avatar, so, you know, we'll get to it later in the list. I do love, you know, kind of the more political fantasy stuff like Assassin's Apprentice and stuff like Game of Thrones. But quest fantasy, you know, that kind of like, these guys, they're going on a journey. We learn more about them. Maybe they get separated, and then maybe they all come back together and we celebrate. Maybe they find new friends along the way, and we learn new facets of the world as they're going on this adventure. That stuff, that's like that's my bread and butter. Like my book, the book that I've been writing is this type of story, essentially. So it ended up actually being a pretty good choice. I think some of the more specific elements that I really like about Eye of the World and just Wheel of Time in general, I really like just how intricate the world is and all the like different magic systems. I mean, I do think it's kind of corny that the magic is like a gendered magic system and it's on a gender binary, and the whole fucking series, by the way, I'm 7 books in, is all about like the battle of the sexes. So if you don't like that stuff, you know, it's not too bad in Eye of the World, but it definitely gets a lot worse as the series goes on. That being said, because that is featured so prominently, you end up getting a ton of female characters and a ton of really good female characters. Nynaeve, one of the main characters, is one of my favorite fantasy characters that I've come across in this like batch of reading. I started all of this stuff back in end of July, like right around the time that I finished the OKKO video was when I really started this. You know, I was like, literally, I was distracted by all of this shit. After doing that, I needed something to revive my soul after doing that project, like drained all of my fucking life energy away. But yeah, Eye of the World, 4 stars. Absolutely recommend it. You know, it's a very good like standalone fantasy, but it does end on like kind of a cliffhanger. This whole world has like a universal aspect to it where like there are main characters, like that's like part of the fiction, is that there are main characters, and then all the other characters are like NPCs or whatever, or secondary characters. So you have like the 3 Taviran. One of them is like the most main character, Rand. He's, you know, spoilers, he's the big hero, the Dragon Reborn, the ultimate badass of the universe, and the most powerful guy to ever exist and will ever exist. And while that's like, to me, that's like a pretty obvious, you know, like, yeah, the fucking first point of view character is going to be the most important guy. You know, whatever. It's not like, it's cliche, sure, but I don't really care about cliches as long as it's done well. Next one is The Little Prince. I gave this 5 stars, and my review was, cried my eyes out while making dinner after work. Would recommend. And I would recommend that shit. I know that Little Prince is not exactly like a unknown story. There's probably plenty of people who like read it as a child, or at least like know about it. I know there was like a movie that I didn't ever want to watch because it had like some framing device of some like girl and her grandpa or whatever. Like, fine. But I really loved this book. It was very quick. I think it was just like one day at work listening to it. I listened to it while also listening to The Hobbit, which is another book that I'll talk about in a second here. Just kind of like went back and forth because, you know, I love The Hobbit, but it is kind of like an older style, so it can get a little bit overbearing with you know, when you're at work and you're vacuuming carpets and doing all that like tedious busy work, you kind of want an escape from that sometimes. So Little Prince is just like a delightful little injection, you know, very episodic storytelling. You know, I love cartoons, so obviously this feels like right at home in that kind of, you know, realm of interests. It's like all about how adults are weird and they kind of suck, and the prince just like exploring adulthood and like about losing a childhood and all these like really complicated themes that are kind of done in a very like whimsical and silly way, but like really potent. The final couple chapters just like kicked me in the fucking balls and just made me like seriously made me sob my eyes out. So highly recommend Little Prince. If you've like just heard of it and you know it's like a good children's book, then just like, I don't know, get it on Kindle or whatever and listen to it. You don't have to listen to it on Audible like I did, waste the whole Audible credit on it. Just get to it and have yourself a good time. After that, we have The Forever War by Joe Haldeman, and I gave it 4 stars. I'm, you know, maybe between 4 and 3 stars. I don't like giving things half-star ratings because then I'm basically just rating out of 10, and I don't like to rate things out of 10. I'm sorry, I just like to do it out of 5. So that's my hill that I'm going to die on. But I did really enjoy this. I heard it was kind of like the anti, like those liberal, the liberal cuck version of Starship Troopers. And, you know, basically Paul Verhoeven's version of Starship Troopers was already the liberal cuck version of Starship Troopers. So I was like, okay, maybe this will be kind of like this. I really enjoyed it. It's kind of like a war memoir type thing. Through a guy who just goes, I mean, he's in the Forever War. He's in a war that lasts 1,000 years. By the end of it, 1,000 years have passed, and like the entire human race is just like inexorably changed by the end. But that kind of like leads into some of my problems with it. I think thematically the story is awesome, and I think like it's such a great concept. And you know, I was listening to this around the same time that I was playing Xenoblade Chronicles 3. There's a lot of similarities between them thematically, with the idea of like a war that's like being kept on for so long that everybody involved forgot why they were even fighting to begin with. However, it does have some pretty funny, kind of homophobic, kind of transphobic stuff with the characters. Like humanity starts to evolve to the point where like straight people are illegal, and because there's a population issue, and like being gay, like that's normal, and the main character is having these like, oh my god, this is shocking. I mean, I had no problem with the homos, but like now they're everywhere. I don't know about this. So it's like a little suspect there, but I think like, I don't know, I kind of interpret it more as camp than it is as like a searing indictment of homosexuality. It also was like written in the 70s, so I'm not going to get like too pissed off about it. Just be aware of that if you're going to go out and read it. But something that was written pre-World War II, I think, we have The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. The man, the myth, the legend. This is a book that I've already read before. I read it in high school, just like on my own. I love this book. My review for it was Rest in Power, Thorin, and absolutely. To me, The Hobbit is kind of like the perfected crystal of like the quest fantasy. You know, obviously other things can do it better or do certain aspects of it better, but it like really perfected it, you know, very early on. You know, you had stuff like The Wizard of Oz and all the Oz books and everything. They're kind of like the progenitors, and I do really enjoy all of those books. But The Hobbit, it feels like, oh yeah, this is taking it a step further. It's still lighthearted and whimsical, but the world feels real, and it feels like there's like logical considerations about all the characters in the world. Without like going too far, it doesn't quite go into like, you know, the later Tolkien stuff like the Silmarillion, where it's like literally just lore that's like explaining, you know, everything that's going on in like meticulous detail. A lot of it is still left to your imagination, which I appreciate. Honestly, you know, like there's in this list, there's a lot of modern fantasy that I love, but at the end of the day, I'm always going to kind of like lean towards the more foundational parts of like any medium that I enjoy or any genre that I enjoy, just because I feel like, you know, you can still see the echoes of that throughout every single piece of media, and like you can still see the echoes of The Hobbit in like any fantasy that you'll read, you know, and Lord of the Rings, you know, to a different extent. But The Hobbit, to me, you know, that's my favorite of all 4 of those books. Next up, speaking of fucked up fantasy, the complete opposite of The Hobbit is The Gunslinger, the first Dark Tower book. This is on recommendation from my friend Cody Briscoe. Go check him out on whatever social media, on his YouTube channel and everything, Cody Briscoe. And he's been bugging me to read this for years, even though he probably knew that I don't read. But now I do, so now I have no excuse not to read it. And this is one of the books that I actually read instead of listening to the audiobook, because I collected all these books over the years with the intention to eventually read them, to get them off my back. And now I've been doing it, and, you know, I really enjoyed it. I only gave it a 3 out of 5, which is not a terrible rating. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's a mediocre either. It's just that, to me, you know, the ratings can be kind of malleable. A 3 out of 5 is like, oh, it has a lot of really good things, but it also has a lot of really weird or bad things. And I think, like, story-wise and structurally, this book is very... It doesn't make any sense. It's like cocaine era Stephen King. Like, he knew exactly what the story was about, but nobody else was allowed to know what the story was about. And, you know, there's just like a lot of baffling, weird things and like weird moments in it, but it's like written incredibly well. It's not too long. King, who I've read a lot of more now, is just like, he's fucking one of the best writers ever, you know, like what the hell could I possibly say that's new other than like, man, you know, when it comes to characters, when it comes to pacing, when it comes to like stylish writing, like you really can't get any better than King. So Gunslinger may be the weakest of the Dark Tower, but it's also the first. It's also kind of a weird experimental book. Just consider it like a really long prologue to the much superior and completely insane in a different, much better way second book that we'll get to in a second here. Next up on my read list is an actual mediocre book, and that is Eragon, the first of the Inheritance cycle. I will not be reading any more of the books. I was not impressed with this one. My review was subparagon. That was my Goodreads review. Yeah, just completely like... I don't know. I mean, it has all the elements that I would enjoy in like a quest fantasy and that kind of like fantasy stuff. And I love the idea that it was like written by a teenager. That's so cool. You know, I always love the weird underdog, like, wow, I can't believe you did it. You know, like, I don't like Chris Neosi as a person, but I think it's awesome that he made something like Tome, you know, and he basically like did that all himself. And he got all of his voice actor buddies to voice in it. He's a fucking asshole, but like, hey, he did it. You know, I wanted to like this in kind of that same way, but it was just so fucking boring. And it was just like, so I feel like I read too much of the good shit too quickly. And then going to this, I was like, man, this is just like mid overdose, just injected right into my veins. Like listening to this audiobook while playing Xenoblade Chronicles 3 like was almost making me like that game less. Anyway, sorry to you Eragon guys out there, but I'm sorry, Christopher Paolini. Maybe you're better now. I'll never read another one of your books. Next up is the second Wheel of Time book, The Great Hunt. I love this one. I actually enjoyed it quite a bit more than the first, even though I think the first one does a lot of things better. Like, it's a more consistent book, and it's, you know, more of a fun, kind of questy, sort of enchanting world. But this one just, like, takes the series in an awesome, kind of darker direction. It still has those quest elements, but, you know, we get to see, like, Rand, he goes into the fucking Lotus Eater machine, and he, like, dies a whole bunch of times. We see fucking Egwene gets like kidnapped by a bunch of insane like warrior like Klingon people, and they like force her into servitude. It's like horrific. It's like that was like some of the most stressful shit I've listened to, and I've listened to many like scenes from the first Law series of like people being tortured, and all the stuff with the Sean Chan torturing Egwene in book 2 here. It's like the fact that she still is upset about it in like book 7. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense considering all of this. I think the only thing that maybe I was a little bit let down by is that, you know, Matt and Perrin still sort of haven't come into their own at this point. Matt is like, he's just like in a really weird spot character-wise in like the beginning of the series. I really liked him in the first book, not that, which is kind of an uncommon opinion, I suppose. But like the second book, he's just kind of like, he's just there. You know, he's just hanging out. He's dying of like demon cancer. And then he gets healed in the third book. So that's when he gets a lot better. I think the only other thing I want to mention is that it's maybe my favorite ending of the series, as far as like the final section where like all this battle is happening. And like Rand is like battling with Balzaman in like the fucking clouds, and all of the town is like watching the battle going on. It was just awesome. It gave me like, you know, episode 11 of Gurren Lagann vibes, where, you know, Simon is battling with Guam and he's projecting it all across the world and everything. You know, again, this is going to keep happening. I think there's only one other book that has an ending that I like a little bit more than this one, but we'll get to that, you know, as far as Wheel of Time goes. We'll get to that later on. Next up is Jade City, the first in the Greenbone saga. I gave it 5 stars, and my review was no peak clan, more like peak fiction clan. And yeah, that's about all you need for that review. Greenbone Saga, it's like Sopranos meets Yakuza the game series, and then they also like Street Fighter. Like they have like Hadokens and stuff. They have like magic jade, and like certain people in this like criminal organization can use the jade, and they can like control magic abilities, whether it be like self-healing, like literally throwing Hadokens, strengthening their body, speed, stuff like that, you know, kind of a realistic sort of like magic system to it. Nothing crazy, not quite like, oh, excuse me. Oh god, not like Wheel of Time where you have like 2 different sources of magic and all these different, you know, the 5 elements, and you can mix different elements in like this like scientific way to do this certain thing, you know. But it's just like, I don't know, I love the Yakuza games. Yakuza 0 is one of my fucking favorite games of all time. I've loved every single one that I've played. This really reminded me of them, where it's like, oh yeah, you're kind of like dealing with, you know, this Asian-inspired city. It's not necessarily China, it's not necessarily South Korea or Japan or anything, or Singapore. It's sort of like a mix of all of these different cultures into one, just sort of like pan-Asian thing, which is totally fine because Fonda Lee herself is Chinese-Canadian. So don't worry, guys. And speaking of Fonda Lee, I think a thing that I really appreciate about this book, compared to some of the other fantasy that I've already talked about and will be talking about, is that it's one of the few ones that has a female author, which is, you know, definitely more common now, but like a lot of fantasy, a lot of the best or like most well-known stuff it's like a very male-dominated industry still. I mean, there's fucking J.K. Rowling, but she fucking sucks, and Harry Potter fucking sucks, so, and fuck you for liking Harry Potter. Fonda Lee, like the character of Shay, one of the main perspective characters, she's just like an excellently realized character when, you know, she really gets a lot of amazing stuff, especially in the second book, like we'll get to that. but either way, you know, I would say Andin is probably my favorite character, followed like shortly by Hilo. Hilo is just like an amazing protagonist, and just like such an awesome asshole of a character, who does a lot of really despicable shit throughout the whole trilogy, but like, yeah, you can't help but love him. And then I would say maybe Barrow is like number 3. He's maybe like my favorite side character in like any fantasy thing. He's just like incredible. The fact that she took like some random thug that appeared in like the prologue and then strung him along throughout so that he's involved with every single politically relevant event throughout like decades of the span of this story, and he ends up being like the most cosmically important character in the entire series. It's just like, mwah! I love it. But yeah, a lot of badass fights, a lot of awesome just like world building, and a lot of interesting writing and character writing and stuff that you wouldn't get, you know, from like the head of a male writer or like, you know, a cis male writer. Speaking of a cis male writer, one of the most famous of all, Stephen King, again, with a book that actually released in 2022 called Fairy Tale. This is fantasy, but more so in the style of like grim fairy tales. I was kind of expecting it to have some connection to Dark Tower. I don't think it does at all. I really enjoyed it. Not as much as I hoped I would enjoy it. I did like all of the grim fairy tale stuff, but it felt like it could have been more fucked up. You know, it could have been like a little bit more Stephen King-y. But I absolutely loved the entire first half of the book. It's just like masterful. It's just like a beautiful story. You know, not like a completely original one. Like there's really nothing super original about anything in this book. But again, you know, originality doesn't really matter as long as you're able to like execute it well. And like King executes like the first half of this book amazingly. This relationship between a guy, an old man who's at the end of his life, an elderly dog, you know, at the end of her life, and just like all of the like bittersweetness and the little wins and the losses and everything that you feel about that, like it just like hit me at a perfect time, and I ended up really appreciating it. So I would say for that alone, absolutely a huge recommend. And the stuff afterwards is still compelling in its own right. I just genuinely think that the like reality, maybe it's like part of the like purpose of the book, honestly, is that the parts that take place in the normal world are like more emotionally gripping and compelling than all of the stuff in the fantasy world. Next we have Wheel of Time 3, The Dragon Reborn. I don't really have that much to say about this one. Rand gets a sword. Rand is not in the book for very long. Rand being the main character, not Ayn Rand. He's like barely in the fucking book. Matt gets to shine really well in this book. I think that this is like where he comes into his own for sure. Perrin gets a girlfriend. Other than that, I'm kind of drawing a blank. Yeah, I mean, like the Aiel show up in this one, and then they become really important in the next one. So, you know, I enjoyed it, but it's definitely the weakest of all the Wheel of Time stuff. You know, maybe if I reread the series at some point in the future, it'll shake out differently, but it's kind of the least memorable. I remember so much of like the first and second book, and I read those, you know, those were so long ago. I mean, it was only like 6 months, but that in the amount of stuff that I've covered in those months is immense. So I still remember those vividly. Whereas like this one, like the only thing I want to remember about it is that I finished the book while sitting on my porch waiting for pizza to arrive. And you know, it was a good pizza. Next up is Beowulf. Don't have much to say about that other than it's the hold on, let me get up this bitch's name. Maria Devana Headley version of it. It's like a more modern translation. They say bro and shit in it and like hashtag. It sounds embarrassing. My friend Nikki described it as like a College Humor sketch. But they are also the one that like were like, yeah, it's still a really good, really compelling version of Beowulf. You know, I really love all these classic stories, stuff like the Odyssey, stuff like Dante's Inferno and Beowulf and Gilgamesh. You know, those kind of like foundational epics in human history. So I definitely was like interested in a more modern translation of it, not necessarily an adaptation of it, just like a translation of it in like a more modern way. And this was like a great way to experience it. It was like the narrator was like beautiful. The prose and everything was just like excellent, despite the fact that, you know, you had some of these like weird modern words in there, but it like fit. I don't know, it just fit. It worked. I don't know what to tell you, but it just like it worked beautifully. So check it out. Next up is The Shining by Stephen King. This might be my favorite Stephen King book that I've read. I think I've only read like 6 or so books so far. But this is amazing. I actually didn't see the movie until after reading this book. And I actually, you know, I love the movie, of course, but the book, oh my God, I can't believe how much I loved the book. It was just, I mean, fucking Jesus Christ. Like, I work a job where I'm alone in a building and I'm cleaning, and hours pass by in isolation, and I feel like I'm being driven insane by the end of the day, you know, and that like one wrong word from anybody can just like set me off. It's like, so this book, I just felt Jack Torrance's pain so much. You know, I've had anger issues in my past and everything, so, you know, I could see the humanity behind him. And I think that that's like the benefit of this version of the story compared to the movie. The movie, like, Jack Nicholson's like fucking insane the second that you see him. But like Jack Torrance in the book, you know, he's just like a flawed dad. You know, he's done some fucked up things. He's a drunk, alcoholic asshole. You know, a lot of alcoholics in Stephen King books. I know he had substance abuse problems. I had no idea if alcohol was part of that. But definitely, you know, Misery, another book that I've recently read, so it won't be on this, is basically just like his therapy session about his substance abuse. But yeah, I'm actually pretty excited to get to Dr. Sleep soon. I really love this world. The Shining is such an awesome concept. Then there's, I don't know, the whole section where like Dick is getting the message and coming back, you know, to the Overlook Hotel is like one of my favorite fucking sections in like any book that I've listened to. It has like a really like awesome ending, just like a really epic, awesome ending, and as well as like a really heartwarming kind of epilogue, which is like something you do not expect from a book that's like maddening and horrifying. But yeah, I don't know. I just loved it. Absolutely. You know, so go check out The Shining. You heard it here first, folks. Next is Guards by Terry Pratchett. This is the second Pratchett book that I read. The first one was Mort. I loved Mort. I loved this book. I gave it 5 stars, and my review was The Only Cops I Trust. It's just like really funny. It's about like incompetent cops that are forced to actually do their job through the hand of like a new recruit that's like way too eager and is just kind of like forcing them to work. You know, Sam Vimes, who is sort of the main character of all of these City Watch books, which I've read a couple after Guards, is just like an excellent and hilarious character, as well as all the other, like the fucking City Watch cast is so good, and every single book adds like so many new awesome characters to the mix. Terry Pratchett, he's just funny as fuck. You know, it's like actually funny. It's not like, I don't know, it's not like funny that you get in like a Brandon Sanderson book or whatever, you know, where it's like, yeah, that's like, yeah, it's like mildly funny. You know, it's like, this is fucking funny, you know? Speaking of Brandon Sanderson, we have The Final Empire, the first Mistborn book. I gave this 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. I think that the magic is really cool. I think the world is awesome. It's kind of like a, you know, I don't know, kind of like Dishonored, but maybe like a little bit less steampunk than Dishonored. People just like jumping around in cloaks and in the mist and stealing from rich people. It's like one half like Ocean's 11, one half like fucking Pride and Prejudice. You know, Vin is infiltrating the rich people and trying to tear it down from the inside. All that stuff is so good. Kelsier is an awesome, like, sort of Kamina-esque, you know, Messiah type guy who died. All of Brandon Sanderson's books are very Mormon, you know, which is like kind of an issue that I have with them. You know, that is that like, I don't know, like, not to be the fucking internet atheist man, but like you can't help but like roll your eyes at how like these recurring themes of like a messiah who sacrifices himself for the greater good and all this stuff like just keeps coming back up. And the like, I don't know. Either way, it was an awesome book, and I do plan to read at least the rest of the first era of Mistborn. You know, I have them all on paper, so I'll be doing it that way. But yeah, I enjoyed it. I wouldn't necessarily say like Sanderson's my favorite Ultimate writer of all time. We'll get to who I believe is the best modern fantasy writer in a second here. But I did quite enjoy this book. All right, well, it looks like we're almost out of time on my phone for recording, so we're going to have to make this two-parter. So I'll just go through a couple more real quick here. Number 2 of the Greenbone saga, Jade War, is next. 5 out of 5. I said, holy fucking shit, dude. That was my review. This is like amazing sequel. The ending of the first one was so awesome and so energetic, and then like it ends on this like, oh shit, sort of like almost a blue ball of a cliffhanger. And then this just like takes that and moves it forward so beautifully. We really explore the character of Andon and him in like this completely new place. We deal with like all of the aftermath of everything that happened in the first book. Hilo becomes even worse throughout this book, but you start to like empathize with him way more in this book too. So it's like really complicated. And like I said before, Wen, who is Hilo's wife, ends up getting like a lot bigger of a role in this book. And her involvement in the climax, I was like breathless, like literally breathless, like the characters in the climax during that whole section. It was just like so vivid too. Like, I don't know how to explain it, but like certain writers are just able to like make the scenes jump into your head in such a like vivid and awesome way that like it's not even like super common either, you know. Like, I'll enjoy a story completely, but I'll not like imagine all the things that are happening like while I'm, you know, listening to it. But like with this audiobook, I was able to like visualize, you know, I was just like hanging on every single word, basically. I just loved this book. It's just got like a lot darker and grittier, and like because you love the characters more and you're getting to know them more, it just became way more dangerous and like fucking horrific. By the end, you're just like terrified that like, oh my god, who is safe? So, all right, and the last one I'm going to talk about for now is the 4th Wheel of Time book, sort of the most beloved one of the series, The Shadow Rising. I would say it's up there. I would say maybe number 2. I think I like the 5th one a little bit more, and I'll talk about that when we get to it. But this one, it just like kind of moved the series away from the quest fantasy, which is fine. I think that they kind of ran the course by the 3rd book, so they did need to pivot. We learn a lot about the Aiel, about Rand's connection to them. That stuff is like, it kind of starts a little, maybe a little boring, and then like it gets more engaging the more you're kind of like getting into it. As well as, I don't know, this book has a really awesome approach where you have like these 3 different perspective stories that are going on with Rand, with the Aiel. You have Perrin, who is back home trying to protect it from a bunch of Trollocs, and he's hanging out with the Tinkers, who are sort of the like pacifist, you know, wandering nomads of this world. And then you have Nynaeve and all of them, you know, like the girl squad, the Femoids, and they have like a Shan-Chan that they befriend. So you have like, there's these characters who are from kind of this like reclusive backwater village, and they're all like interacting with like these different cultures that we've been introduced throughout the series. And we explore the depths of these cultures that we've never quite gotten before, and see them in like a new complicated light. I think that's where it really shines, but the Perrin stuff is just so good in this book. It's definitely the best plot thread by like a fucking large margin, in my opinion. And just the entire final battle, like it was one of the few times, you know, besides the Little Prince, where I was like crying. at the end. Like, it was just like so emotionally cathartic and awesome. Just like perfect kind of war scene and like payoff and everything. Just like so sweet. I don't know. It was just like such a well done book. And like the final fight where like Rand fights with what's his fucking name, who becomes a character in the 5th book. It has like a DBZ fight with him, and then he like creates an oasis in the desert, like literally creates an oasis in the desert. It's just like, oh my god. I don't know, there's just something so beautiful about that. Yeah, I really love this book. I think after finishing it, I was like a little bit more complicated, like maybe it's not as good as other people said, but no, like months later after like looking back on it, I fucking loved this book quite a bit. But I still think 5 slightly edges it out, though they're very close. They might as well be like tied. All right, we got some more books. This is definitely not a different day or a different month entirely. I'm definitely recording this the next day, the following day, right after I recorded the last one. So here we go. Just ignore that my hair and shirt are completely different now. Anyway, next up is The Golden Compass, the first His Dark Materials book. I wasn't too crazy about this one, but it ended up being my favorite of the His Dark Material books. I read the second one, and I'll talk about that later, but I never actually read the third one. I didn't get around to the third one. This one, I liked it in concept so much more than in execution that it was kind of ridiculous. I think the idea of a world where everybody has like a personal Pokemon, like it's a fucking thing that's like represents them and is like their opposite or is like their complement in some way with the demons, is such a cool idea, and so it's like fucking free character writing in my opinion, yet somehow they screw it up and like all of the demons are just super boring. The main character is like a pretty interesting protagonist for like a children's book, just because she's kind of like an amoral sort of street urchin character, you know, like that's not like super uncommon, but it is like definitely like a little bit more uncommon, especially in like children's fantasy stuff. You know, I also read Redwall at some point, and that one, you know, like the main character is just like just a nice guy, you know, like a lot of times these books, the characters are just like nice people, you know. So what is her fucking name? Whatever. The girl in this book series is like, yeah, you know, I enjoyed her. I enjoyed the talking bears and everything, but it's just like, unfortunately, like it didn't really 100% click with me. But I still gave it 3 stars. You know, I still enjoyed it enough to give it like a 3-star rating. But I guess we'll have to see how the second book turned out. Well, I'll say at least that I heard a bunch about how His Dark Materials was like this awesome, like anti-religious thing, and that seemed like cool in one respect, but like none of that shit really came up until the very end of the book, and then it's like a huge part of the second book. But again, we'll get to that when we get there. I'll say that the book didn't become interesting until literally the final couple chapters of it. Then it got interesting. Next up is Roadqueen, Eternal Road Trip to Love, which is a graphic novel. I put it on, you know, it was on Goodreads, so I still counted it as something that I read this year. By Mira Onchua, who is one of the storyboard artists for OKKO. I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but I'm a pretty big fan of that show, and I'm a big fan of basically every single artist who worked on it. So I was really excited to check this out. I found it at Barnes & Noble when I was there getting a couple books. I got it at the same time as I got the first Stormlight book, which I just finished. You know, so it was a 2023 book, so it doesn't count. And Lies of Locke Lamora, which I'll talk about later. It's good as fuck. But this book, Roadqueen, I believe it was something that Mira made before working on OKKO as like a webcomic. It's just a really great, really sweet story, like really awesome character designs, really fun, kind of like elevated, cartoony sort of world in a way that it definitely like pays its homage to things like Utena, without being like fantasy, you know, but it has like this heightened sense of reality to it. But yeah, I absolutely loved it. I knocked it out in a single night, you know. Graphic novels, like I read manga, so like it's not super hard for me to like knock that out. Next up is Dark Tower 2, The Drawing of the Three. Man, this was a fucking kick-ass sequel. It's, when you get right down to it, the whole plot of it is Roland walking on a beach for a bunch of time. And that sounds boring as shit. It's just like him on the beach the whole time, you know, but like the things that happen on that beach, extremely good. First of all, I want to say very ballsy for King to immediately like handicap the main character of his series like super early on in the second book. Like immediately he gets like his hand fucked up, and then he can't like dual wield pistols anymore, and then is just like dying of a viral infection the entire book, and is like having to contact people from our world, and starts forming bonds with them. The character of Eddie is definitely like one of my favorite characters that King has ever written, especially like now that I'm reading the third Dark Tower book as of recording this. Man, Eddie, I love him so much, and his role in this book is great. It's so many like some of the funniest stuff I've ever like read is out of this book, like a very unexpected place. And I don't know, I think just like the action is so good. The climax of this book is just fucking nuts. It's so fun, and it's just like really set. It feels like the actual first book for sure. Like the first one almost felt like just a proof of concept, and like backstory for the third book, and then this one feels like, okay, this is the first real Dark Tower book, and then 3 is like, okay, this is the first real like actually Dark Tower, the quartet going on an adventure kind of book. But we're not going to talk about that now. So just know, second book, I loved it. I gave it 4 stars. You know, I didn't say it before, but I gave Road Trip. That was also 4 stars. It was also excellent. So thumbs up to both of them. Next up is one of my new favorite series, and that's The Blade Itself, the first book in the First Law series. My God, I think Joe Abercrombie has quickly become my favorite fantasy author. Maybe my favorite author out of like everything that I've read, even over King, even though I love, like, The Shining is such a good book, and you know, all the Dark Tower stuff that I've read has been excellent. Currently listening to the audiobook for Mr. Mercedes, and did for Dr. Sleep as well, just like a couple weeks ago, and it's all just like top shelf stuff from King. But Joe Abercrombie, I feel like, has this like certain personality and sense of humor that I just absolutely love. Like, these books are really funny, despite the fact that they're considered like grimdark, in the same category as A Song of Ice and Fire. And those, like A Song of Ice and Fire, I also think can be like really darkly funny in a lot of ways, like especially with characters like Tyrion and Theon. But this book definitely feels more like a dark Discworld, in a way, especially where like you have one of the main characters is a Gandalf type wizard character, and you know, spoilers for First Law, but he's like the worst person by like a long shot in that universe. And we get like a little bit of that in this first book, but it really starts to come in the second, and then the third book just like completely cinches just how terrible of a person he is. But either way, like, all the POV characters are just so fucking good, really funny. You know, Giselle is just like a hilarious douchebag. Logan is like really sympathetic, even though like he has this dark and horrible past. You just like really feel for the guy and want him to get better. You know, Glokta, again, like, you really, like, he's probably the best character in the entire series. He's so fucking funny. It's like, his inner narration is just, like, constantly quippy and everything, but it doesn't feel, like, overbearing. It feels right, because he's, like, this emotionally and physically damaged, mangled fucking wreck of a person, and just like getting these like insights as he's being like this obsequious toady on the outside, but then on the inside, like we see, you know, it's like taking that Igor type character and like, what does this guy actually think, you know, as he's like obeying his master and doing his deeds diligently, you know, and getting to see that, it's just like, man, what a hilarious and awesome character. This book, I'll say, is probably the weakest of all of the First Law books. I mean, it is the first. I still gave it a 4, but it is like, it definitely is just like the beginning of something great. Ton of potential that is seized upon in the later books, thankfully. And I can appreciate it even more after having read like the latter 2 of this first trilogy, as well as 2 of the standalone books at this point. But you know, it is kind of like, it's a little bit thin on the actual story, and it kind of ends right when, like, the adventure is beginning, but we'll get to that, you know, soon. Next up is Men at Arms, which is the second in the City Watch series from Discworld. I love this one. I don't think it's quite as good as Guards, just because the satire it goes for is, like, a little bit more dicey. You know, it is going for more of like a racial fantasy racism sort of prejudice thing. I think it's like pretty well done for the most part. There's definitely some oopsies in there, and things can get a little bit muddled, but like I think the problem with like most racism plots and like fantasy stuff is that it's so self-serious and it's trying to like solve racism, and it's just horribly backfires. It just ends up being like really offensive, actually, instead of being you know, any type of forwarding or progressive or anything like that, whereas this is just purely in the state of satire. You know, I won't talk about it too much because it's something that I read this year, but something like Gulliver's Travels is like satirical of England and colonialism and the explorers and everything like that. So like, while it has some potentially racist things in it, it's still like, its purpose is purely comedy, you know, and criticizing. So like, this isn't quite, you know, Gulliver's Travels like a 300-year-old book, so this isn't quite like that extreme, but it is like a similar type of thing where there's like, yeah, there's some things where like I kind of cringe at now, but like overall, just like it does so much to add to an already like a great world bursting with characters, and it just like does nothing but like add to it and make it more interesting and more complicated, and set things up for the series to just keep getting better as it goes. Speaking of series that just keep getting better as they go, Jade Legacy, the third of the Greenbone saga, I gave that bad boy a 5, just like I gave the last 2 books. Holy fucking shit, I can't believe it's the best one. Like, it's crazy how much better, like how they just keep getting better, you know, because all 3 books are like masterfully written, super exciting, super engaging characters, a brilliantly conceived world and like power system and everything, you know. And then this one is like the most ambitious. I described it to my friend Nikki at one point that it was like, it's like the Planet of the Apes trilogy, which if you don't know, we've done a podcast series on the modern Planet of the Apes movies, where like the first one is like, okay, this is like the Hollywood blockbuster, you know, like it has an emotional core, but it's just like getting you into the world, and it's like very action-y oriented and just like kind of, you know, kind of wish fulfillment in a lot of ways. The second book, Jade War, is more like the second Planet of the Apes movie, where it's like, oh my god, you know, things are going horribly wrong, all of these factions are like fighting each other and like hurting each other in these ways, and then it just keeps like, things just keep getting worse, and it ends in this like harrowing sort of like holy shit, I can't believe we made it out of that alive. And then this one is like, it's like biblical, like similar to the third Planet of the Apes movie, where like by the end you feel like you've aged 1,000 years. It takes place over the course of like multiple decades. You're just like, you're just seeing every single aspect of like this world taken to like its logical extreme, and like progressed in some way. The world changes, the characters and the dynamics are constantly evolving. It's just like such a brilliantly conceived book. It feels like it's like 3 books combined into one. But like the fact that this is just like a nice, concise trilogy, I really appreciate, because I love Wheel of Time, I love The Expanse, but like those don't necessarily need to be like that long. The Wheel of Time doesn't need to be 14 books. The Expanse doesn't need to be 9 books. They could have just written the story in a way that would be more condensed. And I think like Jade Legacy shows, like, yeah, you could take something like books that could have easily been ideas that could have easily been expanded into several books and just condense it into one and make this one just bursting with characters and awesome set pieces and just like great developments, a worthy ending to my favorite character, Barrow, just good stuff all around. You're wondering why my glasses are different, which I just noticed that I'm wearing my broken glasses. It's because I can see out of these ones better, okay? So just don't make fun of me in the comments, please. Speaking of The Expanse, the first Expanse book, Leviathan Wakes, I really enjoyed it. I gave it a 4. I think that like it's just like a really, really solid sci-fi thing. It's not like super high concept or anything. Like it's fairly normal sort of concept for sci-fi with like, oh, here's an alien weapon. It's like a fucking virus that infects people and turns them into zombies and everything. Like that's like Halo. It's kind of like Metroid Prime with Phazon, to the point where the proto molecule is even, glowing in blue. And the fact that it's called the Leviathan Wakes only makes me think of Metroid Prime 3 with the Leviathan seeds. But I don't think that was intentional. I want to believe it is, but I don't think it is. But like really strong start to the story, great cast of characters, a really great sense of like realism and purpose in this world. A lot of like little things that just like make the whole world feel more real. Yeah, I mean, I can't say too much about it. Like I wasn't like rapturously in love with it, but I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed it enough to want to continue reading it, the series. Speaking of things that I have a hard time explaining why I like, Gideon the Ninth, this book is fucking insane. I read it on recommendation from one of my friends, and if you're watching this, Brandon, shout out to you. And it's just like a weird, crazy written book. Just so many things and rules of like writing that it like completely abandons, but it's able to like do great things with its like reckless abandon because it's so well written. I'm just shocked because most books of this type are just complete crap. Like most things, like most times I've seen like reviews or videos talking about like, okay, this fanfic writer they're coming out with their debut novel, and it's like this weird sort of, subversive take on YA tropes and whatever, this is kind of like somewhere halfway between, it's like between the like magic school, like people going and you're seeing all these different characters sort of trope, and also like, Murder at the Orient Express combined, like a murder mystery thing going on. But then it's like written, like it's just the voice that it's written in is like completely great. It's just like so weird and so engaging, and like the plot is just like, it's one of those plots where like you don't understand what's going on for most of the book until you get to the end, and then you're like, oh, this was what was happening the whole time. I understand now, for the most part. But yeah, I loved it. Gideon I really enjoyed. Harrow I loved, so I was really glad that she got the focus in the sequel. I haven't read the third one yet. I think Harrow the Ninth was something I read this year, so I don't think that I'm going to talk about it in this video, but we'll see. Honestly, I kind of forgot most of the stuff that's on this Goodreads list, so if we get to the cutoff point and I haven't talked about the second one, just know that I did enjoy it and I do plan on reading Nona the Ninth. Next up is probably my favorite, no, you know what, I'll say definitely my favorite Wheel of Time book as of recording this, and that's Fires of Heaven, the 5th book it is, I think it and 4 are like really close because they're very closely linked to each other story-wise. Uh, One thing I really loved, I just loved the way that 4 ended, especially with like all the stuff with Perrin was great. And Perrin like is persona non grata in this book, unfortunately. But I don't feel too bitter about that just because I think he got so much good stuff in the 4th book. But I did really love Rand having like a DBZ battle with Asmodean and then like roping him in and making him, you know, his like, yeah, you're a fucking channeler who's a man. You can teach me what to do, even if you're evil. And then like just like that whole dynamic is just like, wow, what a weird and cool way like this is progressing, like that this story is progressing and everything. And the way that this book like continues to like every book has just like opened up the world and changed the status quo in such like a huge way. I feel like the first time that really didn't happen by the end was like the 7th book. You know, not to get too ahead of ourselves, but like really the only big thing I can think of that happened in the 7th book was just Nynaeve unlocking her ability to channel completely. Speaking of Nynaeve, in this book, I think I love her plotline. I love the whole plotline with the circus and with Brigitte, and just like all of that stuff is so funny. Like Nynaeve going to like the cult of people that worship Rand, and just like having to like bite her tongue to not be herself and ruin everything, get everybody killed. And then just so much like great stuff as far as like character building and everything. This book is like the weirdest and horniest one too, like by a long. I don't know what was going on with Robert Jordan, but he was like, he really needed to fucking come. He was writing this book with his penis, and there's just so much like embarrassed naked female stuff. You know, there's so much, which is like in all of the books, but like there's way more in this. There's a scene where one of the characters is like comes into a room naked, gets embarrassed, and then runs out, like opens a gate into the fucking polar ice cap, and then runs, and then Rand has to come and save her, and then has sex with her to warm her up. So a lot of horny times. I do appreciate it. I think this is the first time that there's like sexy times happening in Wheel of Time, and then it becomes sort of a staple, you know, or it becomes more normal. But like just the whole finale, I thought was like definitely, it's just so good. The fight between Ravine and Rand, they're like, you know, Rand goes fucking Super Saiyan and gains the powers and like the personality of Luce Theron, and it's just like shooting Kamehamehas, you know, they're shooting like Balefire. The spell that they're using is so fucking badass and powerful that it erases things from existence. So then their effect on reality is also removed. So he's trying to, like, the reason he's using this like reality breaking spell is so that he can kill the guy who killed his friends and then stop it so that he never killed his friends. You know, depending on how powerful the blast is, like the more into the past it's affected. And it's just like an exciting, awesome, emotional finale while also having the stakes of like, Jesus, he might destroy reality by doing this. So really love that. You know, just like with the 4th book, it was one of the few times in Wheel of Time that actually did make me tear up. I think another one very early on was in Eye of the World, where there's a moment where Matt has one of their many nightmares where they're getting harassed by who we learn later is Shamael. And like he wakes up and is just crying into Rand's arms. Stuff I like crying while watching something or reading something or anything. It just helps me forge like a more raw emotional response to it. I think that's why I loved The Little Prince so much, because it just like made me sob my eyes out. So just like ending a book like on a high note is a good way to like leave a really good impression and make me think much more favorably of it. But I think overall it was just a ton of fun to listen to it because it's so flawed. Like it's so weird and horny and stupid that like it was just like a blast to listen to. Speaking of things that are really fun when they shouldn't be, is Before They Are Hanged, the second First Law book, I think my favorite still, because it's the quest one. It's the one where like the characters actually change and start to become better people, even if that's sort of like intentionally backtracked in the third book. But like, I absolutely loved it. Like the fact that the first book, you know, Galacta was definitely my favorite aspect of it. But the fact that I was like, oh, well, you know, his stuff, like, that's fine. Like, it was still entertaining and he's still a great character. But like, all of the stuff with Giselle and Logan was just so well done and so engaging and like kept me just like, I couldn't stop listening to it. You know, and like it has like the funniest. Can I just say that Stephen Pacey, the audiobook narrator, is like he's like the best audiobook narrator out of everybody that I've listened to, you know, with a lot of these books. Just absolutely brilliant. So good at like bringing different characters to life. Stephen Pacey reading the sex scene between Logan and Pharaoh, it's just like the funniest sex scene I've ever read in like any fucking book or like ever heard in any. It's just like you couldn't have picked two better characters or two like least like the least sexy characters basically to have sex with each other, and it's just like so good. I loved it so much. Yeah, I absolutely loved the second First Law book. It was like it had like such a fucking anticlimactic ending, you know. In like I don't know, it's so weird that like Joe Abercrombie can just do so many like, oh, here's this like whatever, here's this anticlimactic thing, here's this character arc that goes nowhere, here's this person that just like dies out of nowhere, here's a character that becomes worse after they get better, you know, and you're still just like, yeah, fuck yeah, dude. You know, I'm not like a nihilistic person. I'm not like, I like people. I have a lot of faith in humanity, but there's just something like really fun and funny about the way like this, how much this world sucks and how much the people in this world suck, and like starting to learn like why that is. And by the third book it starts to become clear that it's like, oh, it's because these like few people that are in positions of power are intentionally manipulating the world to be shitty in order to like further their own petty grievances with one another. Just great stuff. So next up is Feet of Clay, which is the third City Watch book. Probably my favorite. This is the last one I've read at this point. I do want to get around to Jingo, but that wasn't available on audio or Audible last time I checked. So I haven't gotten around to it yet. But this one, you know, I love golems. It's all about like golems and AI, like in that kind of fantasy sense. And it sort of like taps into everything I love about AI stories and golems and fiction and everything, while also continuing to be just like, oh, it's a really funny, you know, it's a Discworld book with these like funny characters, and it's like broadening the world of the City Watch and Inkboard Pork in general. It's not the funniest. I still think Guards is probably the funniest. Maybe Men at Arms is like a little bit funnier, but this, I think like this was the one that like served, I think was the most well-rounded, you know. Like Terry Pratchett, I think is the strongest when he's able to weave in both comedy and like actual good emotional stakes. Like Mort has a lot of that. I think Small Gods is probably the absolute best one, where he's able to like both give you like a really funny and entertaining story in that way, but just like lay on these emotional haymakers. And this is the first time I really felt that when going through all the City Watch stuff. So Feet of Clay, I absolutely loved it. I think that the ending was great. All the characters and everything, like Sherry is just like such a great character to add into the mix. So the only criticism I guess I'll give it with the audiobook is that like I think Nigel Planer is just like I think he's like a fine narrator, but he's just not the best. You know, I wish they would get different people more often. Actually, if I have one complaint about Small Gods, which is not something I read this year, so I won't be talking about it, is that Andy Serkis did an audiobook narration for it recently, And it's really good until he starts talking with an American accent, and then it sounds like he's reading the English language for the first time in his entire life, and it sounds absolutely terrible. So that really detracted from my experience with that book. But Nigel Planer, like, I think is good. It's just certain characters, I think, are sort of lackluster because you start to get mixed up in your head, like, oh, who is talking at this point? You know, he doesn't have enough voice. Man, I read way too many fucking books last year, dude. We still have a lot to go. Next up is Caliban's War, which is the second Expanse book. I guess I'll just say, like, same, like, general opinion as with the first book. I did enjoy it a lot more. I think all the POV characters were a lot better this time. You know, there was only 2 in the first book, and this time there's 4, with Holden as well as Avasarala and Bobby and Prax. All those characters I felt were, like, way more interesting than just, you know, Holden and Miller in the first book. I do like both of the, you know, I like Holden and I like Miller, especially his characterization post-death. I really like. But this one, you know, Avasarala, just, I love bitchy old ladies, you know. It's just like one of my weaknesses for characters, so I just loved her so much. And this whole book, like, it felt just more like, I don't know, like, I'm surprised that the Expanse show didn't adapt both books, like the first and second book, as just the first season, because, like, the first book almost feels incomplete without this one, you know. So the fact that they extended that it took 2 seasons to adapt the first book is insane to me. You know, I don't think that there's, like, enough material, and I think that, like, the second book feels like just a natural extension of what happened in the first one. So yeah, I really enjoyed Caliban's War, and I don't know if that's, like, a super I saw some people, like Daniel Green and shit, that were saying, like, oh, this one's not as good, this one isn't, you know, as, like, thinky or interesting. I'm like, I don't know, I like characters a lot, so to me, you know, maybe that's why I like the First Law books over a lot of other fantasy stuff, even Wheel of Time, is because, oh, the characters are just so well written and so well realized. And in this book, like, you know, not only do we get a bunch of new characters that are really interesting, but we get to see new sides of the characters on the Rocinante, and, you know, especially people like Amos. Yeah, they just, like, did a really good job, you know, just a really good sequel. It didn't feel like it sagged at any point. It didn't feel, like, arbitrary at any point, and it just made me excited to get to the next book. This one is maybe a little controversial, but I promise I did really enjoy this book, and that's Assassin's Apprentice, and I gave it 3 stars. One, gotta say, once again, I appreciate having a prominent female writer with Robin Hobb, and I appreciate the different, like, this is a 90s fantasy book, and the fact that it's, like, so introspective and so, like, personal of a story, it feels like, and this is all pre A Song of Ice and Fire, you know, this is, like, contemporary with early Wheel of Time. Just that it's so fucking slow, and so, like, just, like, trailing off, and all this, it's just, like, literally exploring every single aspect of this guy's life. From birth to, you know, adulthood, and, like, I think cumulatively by the end it becomes engaging and you're, like, invested in what's going on, and I really enjoyed that. But I think because overall this is the first time I really had to, like, go on and make it like, oh, we're moving up from 1.5 to 1.75 speed here, you know, on Audible, to, like, I think I couldn't in good conscience give it, like, you know, a perfect or fantastic rating. I have to kind of give it, like, yes, it's really good, but there's a lot of things that are holding it back, and I really, you know, I want to get around to the other 2 books in the Farseer trilogy, for sure, just because I think Fitz is, like, a great character by the end, but he's really, like, the only great character, because we just spend, you know, all of our time in his head and following him, and all the other characters are, like, either complete fucking assholes, or, you know, aren't like super developed or super memorable in my opinion. Like they'll do really cool or memorable things, but you know, I couldn't recall the names of like any of the other characters in the book. But speaking about books with great characters and peak fiction here, we got Last Argument of Kings, the third First Law book. I had a really quick turnaround. I just really wanted to get through and finish that first trilogy. So Joe Abercrombie, man, this third book is like, I'm not like a huge fan of like military fantasy in the sense of like big wars and people fighting and shit like that. I like action scenes, but I like them to be more like character versus character, rather than like force versus force. I think I like it slightly less than the second book, but it's really hard to like make that decision, because it's like, oh man, so much good stuff with like my favorite characters in the form of Glokta and Baez. You know, they just get their absolute best stuff in this book. So many, like, and there is a lot of fucking awesome fight scenes that are character versus character. You know, Logan versus Fenris the Feared is like just like one of the most memorable fights that I've experienced in fantasy. You know, as well as like, you know, inside of the you know, the Maker Tower, where Baez fights with like the demon lady, like a TBC fight, and I was like, this is fucking awesome. So like, there's a lot of cool factor to it, but it just like, it ends the story in like a super depressing and yet weirdly like correct sort of way. It's hard to say satisfying, but it feels like, yeah, this is how this story seems like it should end. You know, whoever wins, we lose, basically. And like, kind of ending the story where like the third book ends where the first book began is also just like a really cool piece of cohesion. And by the time that you get to the standalone books, any mention of characters from this first trilogy of books, like it feels like a special little treat that you're given, you know, when like the characters show up. Like I had just finished the Heroes, and Baez showing up and being himself, and especially his stuff like at the very end of the book is just like, mwah, oh god, you know. And that's the strength of like this trilogy, just building up that world and that cast of characters and just like defining them so well. So absolutely recommend all three of those books, as well as like the standalone books. You know, the two that I've read so far have been absolutely phenomenal. But I also read them in 2023, so they are not all right, well, time for the exact opposite of the First Law, and that is The Wind in the Willows. I gave that 4 stars. It's like, it's just a very charming, delightful story. You know, a turn of the century sort of story. It definitely feels like very elemental in that, like, it will inspire tons of children's literature afterwards. Stuff like Winnie the Pooh or the Railway series or things like that. You know, it's just like, I don't know what else to say other than like, it's just like a really fun, breezy read. Really well, like, just like, I don't know, Mr. Toad's funny. Like, all the characters are great. It's just like a charming world of like all these blowhard, like British gentleman animals hanging out, doing shit together. Mr. Toad fucking up and going crazy. You know, just like a lot of good stuff. You know, I'd only seen the animated version of it by Disney. So that's like my only frame of reference for Wind of the Willows until reading it. And I'm glad that I did, because it was like a nice palate cleanser after how like fucking depressing the you know, experience of the finishing First Law was. And I don't know, it was just like, yeah, it was just like a great palate cleanser. And I like to do stuff like that, you know. I don't like to read only like dark, depressing fantasy or horror or stuff like that one after another. I kind of like to bring some variety in there. So I decided, after, I guess, bringing in the variety, that I would read something that is bad. And that is The Subtle Knife, the second, his Dark Materials book. gave it 2 stars. It has enough good ideas in it that I didn't feel like giving it a 1. I don't think anything I've read deserves a 1, but like, man, it really just proved to me how like much missed potential there is in this world, and how like lackluster, like how interesting the world building is on a conceptual level, and how badly executed every single thing about it is, including the like anti-religion stuff. It's just like so embarrassing and like borderline juvenile with how like repetitive and over the top it is. You know, like I'm not very fond of religious hierarchies myself, but you know, I think that there are better ways. Like I think like something like Small Gods like does a really good job where like, if whether or not you're an atheist or agnostic or Christian or just religious in general, you can come away from that book not being insulted, you know? Like, it's critical of religion and faith and things like that, but also like very supportive of it in a lot of ways. Whereas like this, I mean, that's not its problem. The problem is not that it's like, you know, written by like an edgy teenager. The fact is like the story is just boring as fuck, and the characters suck, and the Lyra, is that her name? Yeah, I don't know. Like everything to do with her is just like her and Pan is just like such a boring duo of characters. I just don't like this series. I don't think I like YA, you know, genuinely. Like everything that I've tried, I've just not liked. I like children's books, and I like adult fantasy, basically, you know, so that's where we're at. Another pivot is The Road by Cormac McCarthy. I gave that 4 stars. Just very simple post-apocalypse. It feels like the perfect gem of like a post-apocalypse sort of like son and father going on a depressing ass adventure. They're like, it's super archetypal and broad in a way that I really like. It feels like an epic legend in some sort of way, similar to like Achilles or something like that, you know, with like, oh, it's the father and the son, you know, again, maybe like in a sort of biblical way. And like, it's just like really ceaselessly depressing, but also ceaselessly like optimistic in the same way. You know, like the world is so fucked up and destroyed, but they're just like continuing to live on. It sort of like proves the point that like, it's really hard for people to die, you know, like living is hard, but dying is even harder. And I think that I don't know, it's like a beautiful, hopeful message in something that seems like such a depressing downer of a book. I really enjoyed it. It was just like a quick, I think I finished it in like 1 day read. So like that, and you know, it was a nice run back after fucking The Subtle Knife sucked my balls. Speaking of beautiful writing, we got Neuromancer, which is I gave 4 stars, and I really love this book, despite the fact that every single time I zoned out at work when listening to it, and then like focused again to listen, I was like, what the fuck is going on? It's just like, it's kind of incomprehensible in a similar way to Gideon the Ninth, where by the end you're like, okay, yeah, I get what's going on, but throughout you start to lose track of like, wait, what's happening right now? But it definitely does feel very formative in the cyberpunk genre, you know, just from like the little bit that I know as far as like Blade Runner and stuff like that. I did try to read Snow Crash, but I didn't even get far enough in that book to consider reviewing it. I just really didn't like it, and I bounced off it. But this one I did enjoy. I read all the way through, and there's a lot of really cool elements to it. There's a lot of like maybe sort of outdated elements to it, but either way, you know, check it out if you're interested in the history of cyberpunk. You know, I know Philip K. Dick is kind of also a forefather of cyberpunk, so maybe I'll get around to like do Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, which I think is a good title. Fuck you, Blade Runner. But either way, you know, Neuromancer, it's just, like, I don't have much to say just because it's like, it's kind of a hard book to describe and like to talk about like the characters in the world. You just kind of had to experience it yourself. Oh dear God, we have only a couple more here. So next up is The Lies of Locke Lamora, the first Gentleman Bastards book. Perfect book. Just like fucking front to back, just an excellently written, hilarious, emotionally like engaging, awesome book. Scott Lynch and Joe Abercrombie, I feel like, are very similar in the writing styles, but like Joe Abercrombie is more stylized and he's like way more nihilistic, whereas Scott Lynch is like he believes in some type of inherent good in humanity, while also expressing like, oh, here's this really shitty, dingy world that we're gonna live in. Maybe like he feels like the middle ground between like George R.R. Martin and Joe Abercrombie, where Martin is like, oh, here's the shittiest, most awful world in existence, but like all the Starks are cool, you know, they're cool people and we like them. But like Gentleman Bastards world, it's just like, yeah, it's somewhere in between that and First Law, and like Locke Lamora himself is just like such a good protagonist, so funny, so entertaining, like following him. You know, it's one of these few books that I believe like really only follows like one POV, and then occasionally will like shift to like a villain POV, or maybe following Jean or something like that, but it like really hardline focuses on the one character, which I think does a good job to like, he's like the centrifuge of like all the most important things that happen in this world, so it makes sense. But like, it is a dense book. It took me a long time to read it, not because I was bored, but just because it was so big and I didn't have like the patience to read it. This is one of the ones that I did read physically. But like, as soon as I got to like the ending section, like once I got to like page 500, I fucking blasted through the book. It was just so well paced. Like the climax is so awesome. It's like burned into my head with how good it is. It's so perfect. I almost don't need to read the other Gentleman Bastards books, because I know it's the series has been on hiatus for a long time, similar to Song of Ice and Fire. So I almost don't want to catch up. I kind of just want to leave it as it is, but maybe I'll break at some point and give a read to the other two books. Next up is a non-fiction book in A Movie Making Nerd, the James Rolfe autobio. As you probably know, huge fan of James Rolfe. I made 2 videos about him and reference him in basically every single video and podcast that I've ever made. So very big fan of James Rolfe. I mean, he's pretty much single-handedly responsible for me becoming like as big of a Godzilla fan as I am with the Godzilla-thon. But A Movie Making Nerd, it was just really awesome. I've always been interested in his like behind-the-scenes stuff, as like early material. You know, just seeing that, it's just like really, there's just something really charming about it, because I was somebody who made a lot of home movies back in the day, nowhere near as elaborate as him, but like anytime I see that in somebody else, like them having the cojones to take their home stuff and like just put it on display, you know, their crappy, cringy stuff that they made as a kid, and put it on display to be like, yeah, you know, this is where I started and here's where I am now. You can compare it. Kind of a side note, but the internet personality Quentin Reviews, he had he does the Fallen Titans series very occasionally. He did a Fallen Titans on himself at one point, and that's my favorite video that he's ever made. Not his like 8-hour long Nickelodeon videos, but the one that the Fallen Titans on himself, where he talks about all of the films he made, like from childhood into like being a teenager in high school and like making all of that stuff. It's just like, I just love that shit. So Movie Making Nerd, you know, I haven't even watched the AVGN movie, but just like reading about the production of it was really fascinating. It kind of makes me want to go out and watch it, even if I know it's like not that good, but like, I don't know, there's just some factor to it. James Rolfe just seems like such a likable guy. It would really break my heart if he was like caught up in some kind of scandal or something. But you know, either way, this book, I think just last year was just like a really good year for James Rolfe. After I feel like 2021, there was a lot of like negativity towards him. There was the that one video where it's like, why does people not like AVGN? And they talk about like how nobody likes Screenwave and stuff like that, and all the controversies that have popped up over the years. I feel like 2022 was like a good run back year for them. So this book, I feel like encapsulates that. It's definitely one of my favorite things that like James has produced in a long time. And yeah, I just getting those deeper insights and seeing different ways that he's connected to me, like the fact that he was in, you know, sort of a special ed class. I was in one when I was in elementary school as well. So I don't know, just seeing, like, getting that perspective, it definitely makes me feel even more, unfortunately, more parasocially connected to him. But I don't know, that can be good. That can be used for good. Like, that energy can be used for good sometimes. So let's hope I can use it for good. Oh man, and the last thing that I read in 2021, that I finished in 2022, not 2021, because I began the Sixth Wheel of Time book in 2022, but finished it in 2023. So I'm not going to count that. Is a Game of Thrones, the first Song of Ice and Fire book. My review, I gave it 4 stars. My review was just, I want Sansa to be happy. I'm 100% Sansa stan. You know, she's my favorite. I think in the first book, Sansa's definitely my favorite of the Starks, and then by the second book, Bran sort of rockets up to that. The second book was the moment I was like, oh dude, I get it. I get why everybody loves this fucking series. But the first book was extremely excellent too. I loved so much about it. I think just the person I am, unfortunately, is, you know, I like when there's like a little bit of a tease for something that will become like a major deal down the road. So the first chapter with the others showing up and murdering the shit out of those people, turning them into ice zombies, is like such a tantalizing way to begin the book. And the fact that within 2 very big books, they really haven't followed up on that in like a substantial way is killing me inside. Because it's so cool, but it's also like I appreciate it because it just makes me even more excited to get to that point. But, you know, Game of Thrones is mostly known for being like very down-to-earth, very human stories and characters. So I'm fine with them holding off on the supernatural stuff for the time being. The first book does end with dragons showing up. Dragons breastfeeding off of Dany being lit on fire, which is pretty awesome. But yeah, like, I don't really have, like, the only criticisms I could give is just like, I mean, the world itself is like fucked up and dark, and, you know, there's sexual assault and things like that are bad. But like, you know, I don't think Martin is like, yeah, I love this. You know, he's displaying it in order to show how like bad and like fucked up this era, you know, like a world like that, this like Regency sort of like, you know, medieval era of the world wasn't like, oh, all the nobilities were so nice and so clean and we've degenerated in society or whatever. It's to be like, yeah, this is how it probably was, you know, during the War of the Roses and things like that. So in Westeros, it's just like an awesome like world and like country where there's like an obscene amount of history put into it that like, it just makes me, when I hear that there's like not just hundreds of years, but thousands of years of history, that makes me very excited for that world. And yeah, just like getting introduced to all the characters, falling in love with all the Starks, hating at first all of the Lannisters, you know, besides Tyrion, who rules. Tyrion in the book, because my only frame of reference was like clips that I've seen of the show. I never watched the show, but people always kind of portrayed him as like, oh yeah, he's like a cool, noble guy. But he's like, no, he's like an asshole, like gremlin little fuckboy guy. Like, you know, so I don't know. I just really loved, you know, it's just like a great starting point for the series, and like all the characters established are excellent. The conflicts, like, it feels like this dramatic starting point to a bigger conflict, and the second book just like really busts the fucking wall down and shows you like how terrible the conflict between the Starks and the Lannisters is going to become. So this book like definitely set a huge, like, a lot of potential, and I'm really happy that as far as I've read, the second book has like lived up to that. The third book I know is one, really fucking long, and two is when things get even more insane, so I'm excited to get to that sometime this year. But that's gonna do it. That's all the books that I read in 2022. Man. Will I do another video like this at any point in the future? Probably. I mean, seeing as these are all just stuff that I started in like July and then got to January, it would probably be twice as long if I were to do it from January this year to January next year. So no, I won't do it again. But I wanted to do this now just because, like, to one, give everybody an idea of like, oh, where have I been? What have I been doing? That I haven't been just fucking off and wasting time. I have been reading and like charging up my brain. Now I'm at least like 89 IQ, you know, at least in that ballpark. And yeah, don't worry, I'm going to get back to making cartoon videos. Don't worry. But I just wanted to give something as like a sort of low effort, you know, throwing it out there, but still like very substantial video where you can just listen to me prattle about books. I might do like scattered reviews like similar to this, like just in front of the camera reviewing books. I promise I won't ever become a booktuber, but I might accidentally become a booktuber at the end of the day, you know. So shout out to Man Carrying Thing again. You inspired me to do this. I enjoyed your book reviews and little things like that so much. He also did a very excellent video essay on the shitty ass Wheel of Time show, which is how I found him. And yeah, don't watch that show. It's not very good. But it's also not. It's also, the reason it's not very good isn't because there are brown people in it. It's because it's poorly written, and the characters are bad in it. And it's not really much like the books at all. The actors are all very good in the show, actually, and I think they're all like really good picks, especially because, hey, if Robert Jordan's gonna be cribbing so much from like Hinduism, then yeah, you should have some people with melanin in their skin to portray some of these characters. It's fine. But yeah, that's gonna do it for this. I have no idea how long this is. Probably gonna be like an hour and a half long with both parts combined. Jesus fucking Christ. Well, at least it will be relatively easy to edit, unlike the OKKO video, which was a complete nightmare to edit. So, take care. See you with the second Adventure Time video.